From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now, or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. Our next story takes us to India, where there is an ongoing massive protest. I want to thank many people who have reached out to me on social media to ask about this, especially Shally S. Thank you so much. This is a story that I think is going to be of great importance to history. And so it's weird that it's not being explored more in the present day. Here's what's happening. So back in September, there were 3 laws that were passed by the current government of India to deregulate India's agricultural sector. As the world's largest democracy, you can imagine their agricultural industry is also pretty gargantuan. The farmers in this country they number among the poorest people in a country that has historically struggled with poverty, at least in recent history. And the Prime Minister, Modi, says that these laws in September, when they're pushed through, Modi was arguing that these laws will, quote unquote, liberate farmers from the tyranny of middlemen. But the farmers feared that they would lose much more than they might gain under this new regimen of laws. They said the main beneficiaries will be agricultural corporations. And history has proven that with these sorts of laws, that's usually true. So what did the farmers do? They took to the streets in a massive, ongoing protest. Before we dive into too much about these protests and the government's response, let's be clear about what these laws do, these new farm laws. First, there are these things called mandis, M-A-N-D-I-S. These are government-regulated markets. One of these new laws made it easier for farmers to bypass those government-related markets and go toward kind of you could call it a free market thing. They're selling produce directly to private buyers instead of going through this market system. Second, they can enter into contracts with private companies. This is something known as contract farming. They can sell across state borders. This also allows people who are trading food, produce, etc., to stockpile it. So formerly, there were prohibitions against too much hoarding because it made it easier for food traders to rig the market. You know what I mean? To maybe price gouge, to take advantage of natural disasters, right? Or a pandemic, for instance. Like we saw what happened with the storm in Texas. The power grids massively price gouged, and they were free to do so. There was not federal regulation that prevented that practice. So here's the concern these farmers have with these rules. One of the big ones is that the new rules remove a lot of the historical safeguards farmers depended on for their livelihood. More than 86% of India's arable land, or cultivated farmland, they would call it, is controlled by very small operations. We're talking farmers who own less than 5 acres of land each. It's sort of a stark 180 from the situation here in the US, where a lot of the agricultural land is owned by a small number of companies collectively known as agribusiness. So these folks, you've got 5 acres of land. You live or die based on that land. And what happens if the laws that were meant to protect you and your colleagues are removed? You won't have the bargaining power that the big businesses have. You won't be able to negotiate the kind of prices you need for a decent standard of living. I know this gets into a lot of stuff that is culturally or politically sensitive here in the US, but we have to understand it's a very different situation because this is an entirely different country. The economics at play are also themselves different. So these farmers believe that the government has betrayed them, that it's left them at the mercy of big corporations. Also, hang on, you might say, why go protest? It's a law, which means it exists in the legal sphere, right? Why don't we just go to court? That's what courts are for. Well, not so fast. Pump your brakes, folks. Even if you are a smallhold farmer who can afford to take the time and the expense to navigate this Byzantine legal system, you're going to run up against another problem, part of the new laws. If you want to resolve a dispute and you are a farmer, you can go to something called a conciliation board, or you can go to admin officers or an appellate authority, but you can't go to a regular court. So that's a hell of a catch-22, right?
Sounds like an arbitration clause or something, you know?
Exactly. You're right, Matt. Just so it very much is. And now we have to understand, because this is food, this is just like water. It has this huge ripple effect across society. And bypassing the mandates, depending on how you feel about the role of government regulation in these kind of things, bypassing these government regulated marketplaces could make trouble for a lot of people who depend on those prices to be predictable, right? And to maintain a certain price point. Why? Okay, so another thing you might be asking, astute listeners, hey, Ben, you said these laws were passed in September. That's true. It's the end of February. Why are farmers protesting now? Because get this, Matt, Noel, Doc, everybody, no one in the government bothered to check with the farmers before they changed the laws.
Oh, there was no consultation, you mean, when politicians were attempting to push through their legislation on behalf of the corporations? What?
Yep. What? And they did all of this without consulting the people who were arguably most adversely affected by these huge changes. So the people went to the streets, talking people power. There was a month-long protest in various states in India. In some places, like in Punjab, they blocked trains. They said, okay, look, if you're going to mess with our industry and we need to be heard, then we're going to mess with things you care about. Like other industries, we'll mess with the money, right? That's what some protests and boycotts are about. Just to be fair, as you can guess, the government said, fiddle-dee-dee, more or less, your fears are misplaced. You are being taken advantage of by opposition political parties. We know what's best. This is for the greater good. So what do you guys think? Have you heard much about the protest, the farmer protest in India?
I'd honestly not heard much.
No, neither have I.
But just in some of the reporting on this story, I'm looking at the Lawfare blog. Mm-hmm. That was the link that you posted, Ben. Mm-hmm. I'm just reading a little bit about I know it's statistics, but I'm trying to look at the big picture here. On here, it's saying that around 50% of the entire workforce within India is in the farming sector in some way or associated with it in some way. That's how they make their money. But farming only makes up about 15% of the country's gross domestic product, which means that's a ton of people to spread all of that possible wealth out, right? And we also know something just from our reporting on farmers within the U.S., just how expensive farming can be, the loans you essentially have to take out, no matter what kind of farming you're doing, in order to have land and equipment and all of those things. What my understanding is that there's already, and forgive me for using this phrase, this is in reporting that I'm looking at, but essentially a crisis of self-harm, of suicide amongst farmers, both in the United States and in India, and I'm certain, but I don't have the details to back it up, in many parts of the world where farming is increasingly kind of being pushed to that edge, right? Where There are a lot of people involved in it. It's crucial, but there's not a lot of money in it, and it's very expensive to operate within. That's really what I'm thinking about here. The individual, like you said, farming family or group, small farm group that has to bear the brunt of what it means, what these, what do they call mandies? What these mandies actually mean for them personally. And then trying to square that with all the pressures they're already under.
Right. And I'm glad you brought that up, Matt, because according to the Indian Express, there is something that could be called a suicide epidemic. That's how it's been reported. In Punjab alone, there were 261 farmer suicides last year, over 2020. That is part of a larger issue or a larger pattern. On average, last year, according to a couple sources, we were looking at the suicide of about 5 farmers per week over the course of the year. And additionally, people are dying during the protest, during the chaos, or during the cold wave when that was at its peak. This is not a metaphorical struggle, is what I mean. You know what I mean? This is not symbolic. There are people who have real concrete needs. They are dying, some by their own hands, because of the impossible conditions that they are faced with. Opponents of the government's decisions are saying things like, these are pure murders. The government could have solved the problem within a week of farmers reaching the borders of Delhi, but the government was indifferent to its own people. And we can see the pattern appears to be escalating, unfortunately. In a 5-month span, June 20th to October 19th, there were about 93 farmers who committed suicide at an average of 18 to 19 suicides every month. But then from October 20th to December 31st, just in that shorter span of time, 96 farmers, people associated with the agricultural industry, took their own lives. This is having a real, measurable, multi-generational impact on the lives of these people who would arguably be the first folks the government should be helping in this case. And, of course, Matt, Noel, Doc, and I, we have never lived in India, right? We are not ourselves associated with the agricultural industry there. But this is serious, and this appears to set to worsen on a number of levels unless something changes. Because the big thing with those mandies that we mentioned is that they set a minimum, like a minimum price that a farmer will get for their crop on certain crops, right? So no matter what an auction goes like to a trader, you will at least get, X amount of currency for Y amount of food or grain, and without that, the rug could be pulled out from people very quickly and in a very violent way. It's something I think we should do a full episode on, frankly, to dig and to get some information from our fellow conspiracy realists who are in India or have family and friends in the area. And we want to be very careful with it because I'll tell you, frankly, I find it somewhat exploitative when you see Western news sources that just put suicide epidemic in the title of an article because they know it will get attention. You know what I mean?
Okay. For sure.
If it bleeds, it leads.
Yeah. But I'm reading an article out of The Guardian from 2017 that's looking at the same stuff. And they're, I don't know where they're pulling their statistics from, but they're saying an Australian farmer dies by suicide every 4 days. They're saying one farmer in the UK takes their own life once a week. In France, one farmer dies by suicide every 2 days. And then they cite in India, more than 270,000 farmers have died by suicide since 1995.
Jeez.
So it's like, I hear exactly what you're saying. Like that, those kind of statistics just out there alone do feel very sensational, especially if you like threw that in the title. But like it does feel like there's something very, very wrong happening. And it needs what you're talking about, a deep look into it.
Yeah, yeah. And here's the thing too, folks. Like, please do not mistake us as people who are in support of the old government monopoly necessarily. That was a system that also had a ton of problems. In the early 90s, India changed some policies and removed some older policies that you could call socialist leaning, opening up the economy, neoliberalism is on the rise, and the economy overall did improve. Of course, we have to remember, as recent history shows us, an economy is not a human population. And the economy can be doing gangbusters while people starve in the streets. It's happened before. But when these changes were brought about, as this incremental shift happens over decades, and as these newer laws hit, you have people on one side saying, hey, farmers, this gives you an incredible amount of freedom. Now you don't have to play ball with the government. Now you can go and free market to your heart's content. And then the people who are the opponents of this, including the farmers at these massive protests, are saying, we can't really compete with, some version of Monsanto or something like that, just to pull an example out. And those are valid concerns. What we find with policies this complex is that there are a ton of factors at play, and there are a ton of opportunists who see this as a wonderful time to make windfall profits. There are, as we've seen, many people who feel that their life has taken an irreparable amount of damage. And the thing about it is, the most bedeviling, the damnedest thing about it is that the human needs that agriculture satisfies are very simple. We know what caloric intake is, right? We know what nutrition is. We know what people need to survive every day through every part of their lives, from cradle to the grave. We have figured out the science, and the science is amazing, but the answers to that stuff on the micro level are very simple. So what happens now?